He walked into the room where she was still on her knees picking up the shattered pieces of a vase she hadn't broken, and he looked at her the way a man looks at something he's already decided to throw away. "Get out," Damien Vescari said. Not loud, not even angry, exactly, just flat. The kind of flat that comes from a man who hasn't had to raise his voice in years, because the word alone is enough to make grown men flinch. Elena Hart looked up from the floor. Her daughter Lily stood in the doorway behind her, 4 years old, holding a small cloth rabbit by one ear, watching with eyes that understood more than any 4-year-old's eyes should. I said, "Get out of my house." And just like that, no explanation, no warning, no chance to speak. Elena Hart was on the edge of losing the only job standing between her daughter and the street. If that were you, kneeling on that floor with your child watching, what would you do? Before we go any further, if stories like this one hit you somewhere real, subscribe to this channel and follow Elena's story all the way to the end. Drop a like and leave a comment with the city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The estate sat at the end of a long gravel road outside the city, surrounded by old iron fencing and trees that hadn't been trimmed in years. It didn't look like a home. It looked like something that had been sealed shut. Elena had driven past the gate twice before she found the courage to stop. The job listing had been sparse. Housekeeper, live-in, immediate start. No questions about the employer's personal life. The salary was almost 3 times what she'd been making cleaning offices downtown. She couldn't afford to ask too many questions, so she asked none. She had Lily in the back seat in her car seat, the rabbit in her lap, a juice box nearly finished. Elena had told her they were going to see a big house. Lily had looked out the window at the trees and said, "Is it a sad house?" Elena hadn't answered that. She parked outside the service entrance where a woman named Mrs. Aldrin, the estate manager, was already waiting with a clipboard and a look that said she'd interviewed 30 women before this one and found reasons to send them all away. She was 60-something, compact, dressed like she'd been wearing the same sensible shoes for 20 years. "You're 10 minutes early," Mrs. Aldrin said. "I didn't want to be late." Mrs. Aldrin looked at Lily. The listing said no children. Elena's stomach dropped. It didn't say that. "I checked, twice." A pause. Mrs. Aldrin looked at the child again. The rabbit, the juice box, the quiet way Lily was standing without being told to. "She'll need to stay out of the East Wing, out of Mr. Vescari's private study, out of the upper floor entirely unless you're cleaning it and she's with you." Understood. "She doesn't touch anything." "She won't." Mrs. Aldrin looked at her clipboard. "Mr. Vescari does not interact with staff. He doesn't eat with staff. He doesn't acknowledge staff except to give instructions. If he speaks to you, you answer directly, you don't elaborate, and you don't ask follow-up questions." She paused. "He's not a cruel man. He's a broken one. There's a difference, but it doesn't always feel like one." Elena nodded. She'd worked for difficult people before. She could manage. What she couldn't have prepared for was walking through that house for the first time and feeling the silence like a physical thing. Not peaceful silence, not the silence of a Sunday morning, but the silence of a place where someone had removed everything that made noise. No television, no radio, no music coming from anywhere. The clocks in the front hall had been stopped. Elena noticed it immediately and said nothing. Lily noticed too. She reached up and took Elena's hand without being asked. Their quarters were in the East Wing's lower level. 2 small rooms with a bathroom between them, clean, functional, a window that faced the garden. Elena unpacked their bags while Lily sat on the bed and looked out at what had once been a garden and was now mostly overgrown grass and dead stalks. A few things were still recognizable: the shape of raised flower beds, a stone path, a rusted iron bench. "Someone used to love that," Lily said. "How do you know?" "Because they made it pretty first." Elena sat on the edge of the bed beside her daughter and put an arm around her and didn't say anything for a while. She'd been a widow for 14 months. Her husband Marcus had died of a cardiac event at 41. No warning, no time to prepare, no life insurance that turned out to mean anything once the lawyers parsed the fine print. He'd been a good man and a careful one, and he'd still left them with debt he hadn't known about, and a daughter who'd stopped sleeping through the night, and a wife who had quietly, without telling anyone, started rationing groceries by week 3. Nobody knew that part. Elena was very good at not letting people know. She started work the next morning at 6. Mrs. Aldrin showed her the cleaning schedule, the supply rooms, which floors needed what attention and when. The East Wing was straightforward. The West Wing, Damien Viscari's private territory, had its own logic, its own rules. You cleaned it Tuesdays and Fridays. You came in, you did what needed doing, you left. You didn't look at the photographs on the desk. You didn't ask about the single child's drawing that had been framed and hung on the wall of his study beside his window. You didn't linger. Elena followed the rules. She was good at following rules when her daughter's stability depended on it. She didn't meet Damien Viscari until the 4th day. She was in the front corridor replacing flowers in the entry hall vase, actual live flowers, which Mrs. Aldrin had told her to order weekly from a florist in the city, even though, as far as Elena could tell, no one ever looked at them. When she heard footsteps on the stairs. Not heavy footsteps. Careful ones. The footsteps of a man who had learned to move through his own house like a guest. She turned. I was taller than she'd expected, not imposing in the way she'd braced for, not the loud, chest-forward kind of presence she associated with powerful men. He was lean, dark-suited, with the kind of stillness in his face that comes either from discipline or from not having anything left to feel. His hair was going gray at the temples. He looked younger than his reputation and older than his age, which she later learned was 44. He stopped when he saw her. Not surprised. He'd clearly known she'd started. But something in his posture shifted, a slight recalibration. Mrs. Hart, he said. Yes. She didn't add anything. She remembered the instructions. He looked at the flowers. Those are the wrong ones. Sorry? My wife didn't like white lilies. He said it the way you state a fact about weather. She preferred sunflowers. Mrs. Aldrin knows this. He paused. Or she knew it. I don't know what she orders anymore. Elena held the vase and said nothing, because she'd been told not to elaborate, and she genuinely didn't know what to say. Order sunflowers next time, he said, and walked past her toward his study. She stood there for a moment after he was gone. The wrong flowers. His wife. Past tense, no explanation, no grief in his voice. Or maybe all grief and no performance of it, which was different. She ordered sunflowers that afternoon. 2 days later, Mrs. Aldrin found her in the kitchen preparing Lily's lunch and said, quietly, like she was delivering news that required careful handling. Mr. Viscari lost his wife and daughter 3 years ago. A car explosion. Targeted. It was meant for him. A pause. He doesn't discuss it. I'm telling you only because you ordered the right flowers and he noticed, and if he notices you, it's better that you know. Elena looked at her sandwich. How old was the daughter? Mrs. Aldrin was quiet for a second. 4. Elena didn't look up. The same as Lily. Yes. Neither of them said anything else. It was that same afternoon that the incident with the vase happened. Lily had been in the front corridor. She wasn't supposed to be there, but Elena had been distracted by a delivery at the side entrance, and Lily had wandered. And she'd reached up to touch one of the sunflowers, the new ones, and knocked the vase. It didn't fall. It tipped, caught the edge of the console table, and cracked along the base. Water ran across the table and dripped onto the floor. Lily, to her credit, immediately crouched down and started picking up the pieces with the focused seriousness of a child who understood consequences. That was when Damien walked in. He stopped in the doorway, looked at the child on the floor, looked at the water, looked at the sunflowers scattered on the marble. And Elena came running around the corner from the side hall, took in the scene in half a second, and dropped to her knees next to her daughter. That was when he said it. Get out! Not loud, not angry, just the 2 words, and the weight of a man who had looked at a 4-year-old girl reaching for sunflowers and felt something crack open inside him that he wasn't ready for and didn't know what to do with except push it away. Elena looked up at him. Lily had gone very still, the rabbit tucked under one arm, not crying, just watching him with those careful eyes. Mr. Viscari, Elena said. Her voice was controlled. I take full responsibility. The vase can be replaced. I'll pay for it out of my wages. Please. She didn't mean any harm. He wasn't looking at Elena. He was looking at Lily. And Lily, 4 years old and unafraid of things that frightened adults, looked back at him and said, I'm sorry I broke your flower. The word your, not the vase, the flower. Something moved across Damien Viscari's face, fast, almost invisible, like a shadow crossing a wall, and then his expression closed again. He turned and walked away without another word. Mrs. Aldrin appeared from somewhere, the way she always seemed to appear from somewhere, and looked at Elena still on the floor and then at the retreating figure of her employer. "You're not fired," she said quietly. "He would have said so if he meant it." Elena exhaled. Her hands were shaking, and she hadn't noticed until now. "What just happened?" she whispered. Mrs. Aldrin looked at the sunflowers on the floor. "He used to say that to his daughter. Your flower. It's what she called them." She picked up one of the fallen stems. She'd have been 7 this year. Elena looked at Lily, who was still watching the doorway Damien had walked through, her head tilted slightly, the way she tilted it when she was trying to figure something out. "Mama," Lily said. "Yeah, Bug. He's very sad." Elena pulled her daughter close and pressed her face into her hair and didn't say anything, because what was there to say? The child was right. The next morning, Elena found the broken vase had been replaced. Not with a similar one, with a different one entirely. Older, more carefully chosen, the kind of thing that doesn't come from a catalog. A handwritten note was folded beneath it. 2 words in sharp, angular handwriting. "Stay, both." Elena read it 3 times. Then she folded it and put it in her apron pocket and went back to work. She didn't tell Mrs. Aldrin. She didn't tell anyone. She just kept the note and kept doing her job and tried very hard not to think about what it meant that a man who hadn't spoken to staff in 3 years had taken the time to write those 2 words for a woman and a child he didn't know. Lily, meanwhile, had discovered the garden. She'd found the iron gate that led to it from the East Wing corridor. It was unlocked, barely, and swung open with enough persuasion from a small hand. And she'd been spending 20 minutes each morning sitting on the stone path, looking at the dead flower beds, before Elena brought her in for breakfast. Elena followed her out there on the 3rd morning. The 2 of them stood in the early cold, Lily in her coat and rubber boots, and looked at the raised beds with their dried stalks and matted leaves, an occasional patch of stubborn green where something hadn't completely given up. "We could fix it," Lily said. "It's not our garden." "But nobody's using it." Elena looked at the beds. She thought about the note. She thought about the stopped clocks in the front hall, and the wrong flowers, and the way Damien Viscari looked at her daughter like someone who was trying not to drown. "Let me think about it," she said. She didn't say no. That was the thing. She'd meant to say no. It was the sensible answer, the appropriate answer, the answer of a woman who understood her position in this house. But she looked at Lily standing in that dead garden with her rubber boots and her rabbit and her absolute certainty that things could be brought back to life, and she couldn't make herself say it. That evening, she knocked on the door of Mrs. Aldrin's office. "The garden," she said. "The one off the East Wing. Who maintained it before?" Mrs. Aldrin looked up from her desk. A pause. "His wife. It was her project. She planted it the first year they moved here." "Is there a reason it hasn't been restored?" Another pause, longer. "Because he won't touch it, and he won't let anyone else touch it. He goes and stands in it sometimes, at night, but he won't touch it." Elena nodded slowly. "Lily's been sitting in it in the mornings." Mrs. Aldrin looked at her. "I know. I've seen her from the upstairs window." A beat. "So has he." Elena absorbed that. "I won't push it," she said. "No," Mrs. Aldrin agreed. "Don't push anything. Just let her be." She looked back at her desk, then added quietly, almost to herself, "It's the first time in 3 years that garden has had anyone sitting in it who wasn't grieving." Elena went back to her rooms. She sat on the edge of Lily's bed while her daughter slept, the rabbit tucked under one arm, her breathing steady and even, and Elena looked at her daughter's face for a long time in the half-dark. 14 months of being alone. 14 months of keeping it together, because keeping it together was the only option when you had a child watching you for signals about whether the world was safe. And now they were here, in this sealed and silent house, and something was happening that Elena couldn't quite name yet and wasn't sure she should. She went to her own room. She lay in the dark, down the long corridor of the West Wing, through 2 closed doors and a study filled with stopped clocks, and a framed child's drawing and sunflowers in a vase that had finally been replaced with the right ones. Damien Viscari sat in the chair by his window and looked out at the garden where a 4-year-old girl had been sitting in the mornings with a cloth rabbit and no agenda, and felt something shift in the architecture of his grief that he had no language for yet, and no idea what to do with. He'd built this silence carefully. He'd constructed it the way you build a wall, brick by brick, year by year, until the thing was solid enough that nothing could get through. He'd let men fear him. He'd let the world believe the grief had burned away everything soft and left only the cold operational version of Damien Vescari, the one who ran the empire, who settled accounts, who didn't look at children's playgrounds when he drove past them. He'd been very good at it. And then a woman with shaking hands had knelt on his floor, and a 4-year-old had looked up at him with his daughter's eyes. Not literally, not physically, just in the quality of the attention, the unsentimental seriousness of a child who had also lost something and was still, somehow, not afraid, and said, "I'm sorry I broke your flower," and something in the wall had cracked. He picked up his glass, put it down without drinking. Outside, the garden was dark and quiet, the dead stalks silvered by cold moonlight. He sat there for a long time. He didn't come to the garden, not the next morning, not the one after that. But Elena knew he was watching. Mrs. Aldrin had said so, and Elena had learned quickly that Mrs. Aldrin said very little that wasn't precisely true. So she let Lily have her mornings there. 30 minutes before breakfast, rubber boots, the rabbit, sometimes a cup of water that Lily would pour carefully at the base of whatever looked least dead. It was a child's logic. Water makes things grow, so water the things. And Elena didn't correct it because it wasn't wrong, and because watching her daughter crouch over a dead flower bed with the focused attention of someone performing surgery was the most peace Elena had felt in over a year. On the 6th morning, Lily found something. She came running back into the kitchen with her boots tracking mud and her fists closed tight around something small, and she opened her hand to show Elena a single green shoot, barely an inch long, pressing up through the cracked soil near the back wall of the garden. "Mama, it's not dead." Elena looked at the shoot, looked at her daughter's face. "No," she said, "it's not." Lily turned and ran back out before Elena could tell her to take off the boots first. Elena stood at the kitchen window and watched her daughter crouch back down beside the chute and cup both hands around it like she was keeping it warm, and she held her coffee cup and felt something in her chest that she couldn't fully name. Not quite hope, which felt too large and too dangerous, but something adjacent to it. Something that had been dormant long enough that she'd almost forgotten it had a shape. She didn't notice Damien in the doorway of the east corridor until he moved. He was in a dark shirt, no jacket, the kind of undone that meant he'd been up since before dawn or hadn't slept at all. He was holding nothing. He stood in the doorway and looked out the window at Lily crouched in the garden, and his face was doing the thing it did when he was working very hard to keep it from doing anything at all. Elena set down her coffee. "Good morning, Mr. Vescari." He didn't answer. Then, "What did she find?" "A green shoot near the back wall." Elena paused. "I think it might be a sunflower from the original planting." His jaw moved. He looked at the window for another second, then turned and walked back down the corridor without a word. Elena let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. That afternoon, a man arrived from a garden supplier in the city with 3 boxes of supplies: good soil, seedling tools, a set of small gardening gloves in a child's size. No note, no explanation. Mrs. Aldrin signed for the delivery and brought the gloves to Lily at dinner and set them on the table beside her plate, and said only, "For the garden." Lily looked at the gloves for a long moment. "Is it okay to fix it?" she asked. Mrs. Aldrin looked at her with an expression that was as close to tender as her face seemed to get. "Yes," she said. "I think it is." Lily put on the gloves immediately and wore them through dinner, which Elena didn't stop because some battles aren't worth it, and some moments are. It was 3 nights after the gloves arrived that Elena found the first of the bills. She hadn't been looking for anything. She'd been going through the accordion file she kept under her bed, the one with every document that mattered, organized by date because disorder made her feel like the ground was moving, and she found a payment receipt she didn't recognize. Her internet provider. Paid in full. Automatic renewal activated. She'd been 4 months behind on that account. She stared at the receipt for a long time. Then she went through the rest of the file. The medical bill from Lily's ear infection in September, the one she'd been paying down in $50 increments, showed a 0 balance. Paid. The credit card debt she'd accumulated in the 3 months after Marcus died before she'd found the office cleaning job, gone. A letter from the collections agency that had been threatening her since spring, marked closed, account satisfied. She sat on the floor of her room with the papers spread around her and felt something that wasn't gratitude. Not yet, because gratitude requires understanding, and she didn't understand this at all. She thought about confronting him. She rehearsed it, walking to his study, knocking, saying clearly and without embarrassment, "I need to know if this was you, and if it was, I need you to stop." She could hear herself saying it. She could hear exactly how it would sound. She didn't do it. She told herself it was because she respected the rules of this house, which included not going to his study uninvited. But she knew, and honesty was something she'd always been brutal with herself about, even when it was inconvenient. She knew the real reason was that if she asked him and he confirmed it, she would have to decide what to do about it, and she wasn't ready to decide. So she said nothing. She put the papers back in the file. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and thought about Marcus, not the way she usually thought about him, which was with a specific structural grief, the grief of a woman cataloging what was missing, but differently. She thought about what he would say about this house, this man, this situation. Marcus had been practical. He would have said something useful and slightly annoying, the way practical people often do. She thought he probably would have said, "You needed help, and help came. Don't make it complicated." She closed her eyes. Outside her window, in the garden, something was beginning to grow. Damien began appearing at breakfast, not joining it. He didn't sit at the kitchen table or eat with Elena or acknowledge the shift in any way that could be named or discussed. He simply appeared sometimes in the doorway between the corridor and the kitchen, with his coffee and his dark shirts and his silence, at the hour when Lily was eating. He didn't interact. He watched. Lily, who had her mother's particular variety of emotional intelligence, the kind that presents itself as simple directness, noticed him on the third morning and said, without looking up from her toast, "You can sit down if you want." Elena froze. Damien said nothing for a moment, then, "I'm fine where I am." "Okay," Lily said, and ate her toast. That was all. But he stayed for 10 more minutes, and the next morning he was there again, and the morning after that. Mrs. Aldrin found Elena in the supply room on a Thursday afternoon, 2.5 weeks after their arrival, and closed the door behind her. That was the signal that what was coming wasn't routine. "I need to tell you something," she said. Elena put down the cleaning supplies. "Go ahead." "Mr. Vescari has a fiancée." Elena looked at her. "Her name is Vivian DeLuca. Her family is political. Old money with new connections. The engagement was arranged 18 months ago. It's not a love match. It's a business arrangement, and both parties understood that from the beginning." Mrs. Aldrin paused. "She visits. Not often, but she visits. She's coming this weekend." "All right," Elena said carefully. "Thank you for telling me. She'll want to meet you." "That's fine." "It won't be fine," Mrs. Aldrin said, with the calm specificity of someone who has watched this particular play before. "She's not a cruel woman. She's a threatened one. There's a difference, as I said to you once before about someone else, but it doesn't always feel like one." Elena absorbed this. "Does she know about—" She stopped. She wasn't sure how to finish that sentence. "About the garden? About Lily?" Mrs. Aldrin's expression was neutral. "She will by Saturday." Vivian DeLuca arrived on Saturday afternoon in a black car that was too expensive to be obvious about it, wearing a coat that fit like it had been designed for her, specifically, which it had, Elena later gathered. And she came through the front door the way people come through doors when they're accustomed to rooms adjusting to them rather than the reverse. She was beautiful. Elena registered that first, without judgment. The way you register weather. It's there. It's a fact. Now move on. Vivian was dark-haired, precise, with the kind of posture that spoke of a childhood full of instructions about how to carry yourself. She was probably 38. She looked younger and felt older. She found Elena in the front corridor, which was where Elena seemed fated to be encountered, and she stopped and looked her over with an assessment that was brief and comprehensive and not particularly concealed. "You're the new housekeeper," she said. "Yes, Elena Hart. And the child is yours." "She is." Vivian looked around the corridor, the sunflowers in the vase, the general quality of the cleaned surfaces, then back at Elena. "The listing didn't mention a child." The listing didn't prohibit one, Elena said, and kept her voice even. Something moved behind Vivian's eyes. A recalibration, like the one Damien had made on first seeing Elena, but colder in quality. No, she said. I suppose it didn't. She moved past Elena toward the main hall. I'll need tea. The Darjeeling, not the breakfast blend. Of course, Elena said, and went to make it. She stood at the stove and was very careful and deliberate about every movement and did not let herself think about anything until the tea was made and in the pot and on the tray. And then she carried it to the sitting room and set it down and left without being dismissed, which wasn't protocol but felt necessary. Lily was in the garden. Elena checked from the east corridor window and watched her daughter crouching beside the flower beds in her small gloves, carefully turning soil around the green shoot that had, in the past 2 weeks, grown another 4 inches and produced 2 small rough leaves. Elena watched her daughter work and felt the specific exhaustion of a woman who has been reading rooms her entire adult life and is very tired of having to do it. Damien found her there. She spoke to you, he said, not a question. Briefly, she seems... Elena chose the word carefully. Precise. She is. He stood beside her at the window, looking out at Lily. She's also not wrong to be concerned. Elena looked at him. About what? He didn't answer that directly. Vivian understands the arrangement. She's known from the beginning what this was. What she doesn't have a framework for is... He stopped. Started again. Things that weren't in the arrangement. We're just staff, Elena said. Yes. He said it without emphasis, which somehow made it carry more. They stood at the window without speaking for a moment. Below in the garden, Lily had found a worm and was very carefully relocating it to what she apparently considered a better position. She talks to things, Elena said, almost to herself. Plants, the worm, the photograph of her father. She paused. She tells them things are going to be okay, even when she doesn't know if they are. Damien was quiet for long enough that Elena thought he wasn't going to respond. Then he said, My daughter used to do that. His voice was completely steady. She talked to the sunflowers. She was convinced they could hear her. A beat. Maybe they can. I don't know. I'm not qualified to say. Elena didn't look at him. She looked at the garden. What was her name? She asked. A pause. Sophia. He said it like he was testing whether the words still fit in his mouth. She was 4 years and 3 months when she died. Elena pressed her lips together, breathed. I'm sorry, she said. It wasn't enough. It never was. But she meant it in the specific, undecorated way that actual condolence requires, without the softening phrases people usually wrap around it to make themselves more comfortable, and she thought he heard that because he nodded once. Don't apologize to Vivian for having Lily here, he said then, without transition. That's not something you owe her. Elena looked at him. She'll ask you to, he added. Not directly. She doesn't do direct. He turned from the window. Just don't. He left. Elena stood at the window alone. In the garden, Lily finished relocating the worm, stood up, dusted her gloves on her coat, and said something to the green shoot that Elena couldn't hear through the glass. Whatever it was, she said it with great seriousness. The confrontation with Vivian came Tuesday morning. Elena was cleaning the sitting room, the methodical, invisible work of it, moving around furniture and not being noticed, which she was good at, when Vivian appeared in the doorway and closed the door behind her with a quiet click that had nothing quiet about it. I want to be honest with you, Vivian said. Elena straightened, set down the cloth. All right. I don't have a problem with you. I want to establish that first. Vivian sat on the arm of the chair rather than in it, the position of someone who is staying briefly and wants you to know it. I have a problem with the situation, which is different. What situation is that? A young widow, a small child. In this house, which Damien has kept sealed for 3 years. At this particular moment, she met Elena's eyes. You understand my concern. I'm the housekeeper, Elena said. We've had 3 real conversations. 2 of them were about flowers. Yes. And he ordered the right garden supplies for the first time since his wife died, and he's been standing in the kitchen at breakfast. Vivian's voice was careful, not loud, not aggressive, just deliberate. I'm not stupid, Mrs. Hart. I don't need things to be obvious to see them. Elena said nothing. I'm going to ask you something and I'd like an honest answer, Vivian said. Are you doing this deliberately? The room went very still. No, Elena said. It came out flat and clean. I needed a job. I have a daughter. I clean your fiancé's house and I keep to the rules of it, and I haven't asked for anything that wasn't already offered. She paused. Whatever you're seeing, you're not seeing what you think you're seeing. Vivian looked at her for a long moment. Something in her assessment shifted. Not softened exactly, but adjusted. All right, she said. She stood. I believe you. She moved toward the door, then stopped. But you should know that what happens in this house doesn't stay in this house. My family has interests here. If this situation becomes visible, there are people who would use it. She glanced back. No, not me. I'm telling you so. You're not surprised later. She left. Elena stood in the sitting room with the cleaning cloth in her hand and felt the specific chill of a warning delivered by someone who had enough self-awareness to know they were giving one. She thought about what Damien had said. Don't apologize for having Lily here. She hadn't. She was glad she hadn't. But she also heard, underneath Vivian's precise and careful words, something that wasn't just threat. It was fear. The particular fear of a woman who has organized her life around a specific arrangement and can see suddenly that the arrangement's foundations are less solid than she'd been told. Elena had been that woman. She knew what it felt like. She didn't pity Vivian, but she understood her. It was 2 nights after Vivian left that Elena's phone rang at 11:30. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer it. Mrs. Hart. A man's voice, not one she recognized. Careful, controlled, the voice of someone who had practiced making themselves sound neutral. I'm calling about your late husband's accounts. Elena sat up. Who is this? Someone with information about the remaining debt on your husband's estate, specifically about who's been paying it down. A pause. You might want to know that the payments are being traced, and the person making them is about to have a very complicated few weeks. If you're connected to him financially, that connection will become visible. I don't know what You do, the man said pleasantly. You've known for at least 10 days. You just haven't asked him about it. A pause. Smart, actually. Deniability is useful. Another pause. I'd recommend you stop accepting any further financial assistance. For your daughter's sake. The line went dead. Elena sat in the dark with the phone in her hand. Her daughter's sake. She was out of bed in 30 seconds, down the corridor, and standing outside Damien's study before she'd fully decided to do it. She knocked. 3 times, not loud, not soft. The door opened faster than it should have, which meant he hadn't been sleeping either. He looked at her face. What happened? Not a question. He read it that fast. Someone called me, she said. A man. He knew about the payments. He said you're about to have complications. He used Lily as a reason for me to distance myself from you. She held his gaze. Who knows you've been paying my bills? Damien's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. A tightening, a shift in the operational quality of his attention, the way a machine changes register when you move from standby to active. Come in, he said. She came in. He closed the door. The study was what she'd expected and nothing like she'd imagined. Books? Yes, but also maps, a board of photographs connected by lines she didn't try to read, the framed child's drawing by the window, sunflowers in the vase on the desk. He didn't offer her a seat. She didn't sit. Tell me exactly what he said, Damien said. Every word. She told him. He listened without interrupting, without moving, with the focused stillness of someone who is processing everything in real time and showing none of it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. The payments went through a shell account, he said, untraceable to me without access to certain internal records. He looked at her. Which means someone inside my organization ran that trace. Elena felt the implication of that land. How many people know? She asked. 2. My account manager and... He stopped, his jaw set. And my second in command, Reardon. Do you trust them? I trusted both of them yesterday, he said. Tonight I trust one. She watched him process that, watched the specific, controlled grief of a man realizing that a person he's relied on has been turned, and that the realization comes too late to prevent whatever's already been set in motion. What does this mean? She asked. For us, for Lily, It means someone is building a case, he said. Not against me. They don't need more of those. Against my judgment. Against the idea that I'm... He stopped again, looked at the window. Distracted. The word came out like it tasted bad. Compromised. Emotionally compromised is the specific phrase they'll use. It's a political argument as much as a practical one. And Vivian's family, said Emily, is political. He looked at her. Yes. The room felt smaller than it had 30 seconds ago. I should take Lily and leave, Elena said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of it for being steady. If we're the leverage, we should remove ourselves from the equation. No. He said it immediately, without hesitation, and then seemed to register that the speed of it was information, and he said it again, more carefully. No. Leaving doesn't protect you. It makes you visible and unsupported, and it tells whoever is watching that the move worked. He looked at her. Stay. Both of you stay. She heard the echo of the note. Stay. Both. If we stay, she said, and this becomes a confrontation. It's already a confrontation, he said. It became one the moment someone inside my organization made that call to your phone. He moved to the board of photographs on the wall, looked at it for a moment, then turned back. Whoever did this, they're not warning you away from me. They're testing whether you'll run and whether I'll let you. His eyes were clear and cold and entirely awake. I won't. Elena stood in the study of a man she'd known for 3 weeks, surrounded by maps and photographs and the ghost of a dead child's drawing, and felt the ground shift under the situation in a way that was unmistakable. This was not what she'd come here for. She'd come here for a job, for stability, for a salary that would let her stop rationing groceries and pretending to Lily that everything was fine when it wasn't. But the ground had shifted, and here they were, and the only question now was what you did when you were standing on new ground with no map and a 4-year-old sleeping in the next wing who had named a green chute and talked to it every morning like it could hear her. All right, Elena said. Damien looked at her. We stay, she said. He nodded once. Get some sleep. I'll know more by morning. She went back to her room. She lay in the dark. She did not sleep. Down the corridor, Damien sat at his desk and made 2 phone calls and ended one professional relationship that had lasted 11 years. And by the time the sun came up, he had confirmed what he already knew, that the leak had come from Riordan, that Riordan had been in contact with the DeLuca family for at least 6 weeks, and that what was being assembled against him was not a simple power play, but something more carefully constructed, more patient, and more dangerous than a simple power play would ever need to be. He sat at his desk with the morning light coming through the window and looked at the framed drawing on the wall, a child's sunflower, yellow crayon on white paper, the stem a wobbly green line, and understood, with the clarity that comes only at certain specific moments, that the season of his careful isolation was over. He hadn't chosen this. He hadn't invited it. But it was here, and the people who had brought it were counting on him to retreat into grief the way he had for 3 years, to fold inward and go quiet, and let them move around him. He wasn't going to do that. He picked up his phone and called the one man inside his organization whose loyalty he still trusted completely, and said, Bring me everything Riordan has touched in the last 2 months. Every account, every contact, every meeting. A pause on the line. Then, You're sure about Riordan? I'm sure, Damien said. Another pause. This is going to get loud. Yes, Damien said. It is. He put down the phone and looked at the window, where the garden was just becoming visible in the early light, and where a small figure in rubber boots and a coat was already making her way down the stone path with a watering can that was almost too heavy for her to carry, moving carefully and without complaint toward something she had decided was worth saving. Riordan came in at 9. Damien was already at his desk when the door opened. He'd been there since before dawn. The file Carver had delivered at 6:30 spread across the surface in careful sequence, each page turned and read and set down in order. He hadn't touched his coffee. It had gone cold 2 hours ago. Riordan walked in the way he always walked into rooms, the easy confidence of a man who had spent 11 years being the second most important person in every space he occupied and had made peace with that. Broad shoulders, a gray jacket, the particular way he held his hands that said he was ready for anything. He'd been Damien's second since before the bombing. He'd stood at the graveside. He'd been the one who drove Damien home from the hospital the night they told him his wife and daughter hadn't survived, and he'd sat in the driveway for 40 minutes because Damien couldn't get out of the car, and he hadn't said a single word the entire time. Damien had thought about that on the drive home this morning. He'd thought about it carefully. "You asked for me," Reardon said. "Sit down." Reardon sat. He looked at the papers on the desk, not anxiously, just noting them, the way a trained man notes his environment. "Carver's work?" "Yes." Damien picked up the top page. Didn't look at it, looked at Reardon. "Tell me about your meeting with Felix DeLuca, the one on the 14th. The room went very quiet. Reardon's face didn't collapse. That was the thing about men who'd been in this business long enough. They didn't collapse. They compressed. A slight tightening around the eyes, a breath that was marginally slower than the one before it, that was all. "What meeting?" "The one at the Alderton Hotel, 3rd floor, private dining, 2 hours. Damien set the page down. "You signed in under a different name, but you used your own credit card for the parking, which is the kind of mistake you make when you've been doing something long enough that you stop thinking of it as a mistake." Reardon looked at the page, back at Damien. "How long?" Damien said. Not a question. A beat of silence. Then Reardon let out a breath through his nose and sat back slightly, and the compression in his face did something different. Not guilt, not quite, but a kind of exhaustion. The exhaustion of a man who has been carrying something heavy for long enough that being caught is almost a relief. 8 weeks. 8 weeks. Damien repeated it without inflection. "Damien, don't." The word came out flat and final. "Don't explain it to me yet. I'm still deciding whether I want the explanation or just the facts." He looked at the file. "The call to Elena Hart's phone. That was you." Reardon didn't answer. "The account trace, pulling the payment records from the Shell account. That required internal access at a level only 3 people in this organization have. You're one of them." Damien looked up. "Was it you or did you give Felix the access?" "I gave him the access." Reardon said it plainly, without decoration. "I didn't make the call myself." "But you knew he would." A pause. "Yes." Damien stood up from the desk. He didn't pace. He wasn't a pacer, had never been. He just stood, because sitting felt wrong for this particular moment, and he moved to the window that faced the front drive and looked out at nothing and said, 11 years. "I know. You drove me home from the hospital. You sat in the driveway. I know. And 8 weeks ago you started feeding my private financial transactions to Felix DeLuca." He turned from the window. "Why?" This was the moment Reardon had been preparing for, probably for weeks, and yet when it arrived he looked like a man who'd rehearsed a speech and found that the actual words had stopped working. He started twice and stopped. Then, "They were going to move against you regardless." Felix had already decided. The engagement to Vivienne it was always a mechanism, Damien. A way to get inside the organization's finances through the marriage contract. When you started pulling back from the engagement, not officially, but pulling back, he accelerated his timeline. And you decided the best response was to help him. I decided the best response was to be inside the room when it happened instead of outside it. Reardon met his eyes. I thought I could manage the damage, keep it contained, feed Felix enough to make him feel like he was winning While you what? Damien's voice was very controlled. While you protected me? Is that the story? Reardon said nothing. Because the version I'm reading, Damien said, picking up another page from the file, is that you gave Felix access to accounts that connected back to a woman and her 4-year-old daughter. And someone from his organization called that woman at 11:30 at night and used her child as a threat. He set the page down. That's not managing damage. That's aiming at a child. I didn't know he would go that far. Then you didn't know him as well as you thought. Damien looked at him steadily. Which means everything else you thought you were managing, you weren't. Reardon looked at the floor for a moment. When he looked back up, there was something genuine in his face for the first time. Not quite shame, but its functional equivalent. What are you going to do? What I should have done 8 weeks ago when Felix started making moves, Damien said. Except now I'm doing it with the knowledge that my second-in-command was in the room. He moved back to the desk. Get out of this house. Don't contact Felix. Don't contact Vivienne. Don't contact anyone inside this organization until I tell you otherwise. Reardon stood slowly. He looked older than he had when he'd walked in. And after? I don't know yet, Damien said. But you should understand that the only reason this conversation is happening, instead of a different kind of conversation, is that you sat in that driveway for 40 minutes and didn't say a word. That's the only capital you have left, and it's nearly spent. Reardon nodded once. He walked to the door. His hand was on the handle when Damien said, without turning around, "The woman and the child are not to be touched, by anyone. If that becomes a problem for Felix's people, it becomes their last problem. Make sure he understands that. You can do that much." Reardon left without answering, but Damien heard it in the way the door closed. Carefully, with intention, the door of a man who understood the assignment. Damien sat back down at his desk. He picked up his cold coffee and drank it anyway. Carver appeared in the doorway 20 minutes later. I was younger than Reardon by 12 years, built like someone who'd grown up doing physical work and never lost the shape of it, with a face that was honest in its bluntness. Not kind, exactly, but straight. Damien had trusted him in a quieter way than he'd trusted Riordan, the trust you extend to someone who hasn't had enough time to disappoint you, which was a limited form of trust but was all he had available at the moment. "Riordan's gone," Carver said. "I know. I want eyes on him. Not close. Just present." "Done." Carver came further into the room. "I've been through the rest of the file. There's something you need to see that isn't about Riordan." Damien looked at him. Carver placed a single photograph on the desk. It had been taken from a distance, the grain of a long lens shot, but the subjects were clear enough. A parking garage. 2 figures. One was Felix DeLuca, gray-haired, thick-shouldered, the look of a man who'd been powerful long enough to wear it like a second skin. The other was a woman Damien recognized by her posture before he could see her face clearly, the specific way she held herself when she was making a point. Vivienne. The timestamp on the photograph was 9 days ago, 4 days after she'd visited the estate. Damien looked at the photograph for a long time. "She came here," he said. "She had tea. She spoke to Elena." He paused. "She warned Elena." "Or appeared to," Carver said carefully. Damien looked at him. "The warning she gave Mrs. Hart, distance yourself, think of your daughter." "It reads like concern," Carver said. "But if you're trying to isolate your target from the one person whose judgment he's started trusting, getting that person to voluntarily step back is cleaner than forcing it." He paused. "It didn't work, but I don't think that was random benevolence on her part." Damien set the photograph down. He thought about Vivienne in the sitting room, precise and careful, telling Elena she wasn't the problem, that it was the situation. He thought about how convincingly she'd done it. He thought about Elena coming back from that conversation tighter than usual, more careful with herself for the next 2 days, navigating her work with the controlled delicacy of a woman reconsidering her foothold. "She's been working both sides," he said. "The engagement gives her family access to your organization's financial structure through the marriage contract. That part Riordan confirmed. But Vivienne has been separately feeding information to her father about your psychological state, the grief, the isolation, the fact that you haven't been functional in 3 years. Carver stopped, then pushed forward. "They've been building a case for incompetence, not in the legal sense, in the organizational sense. If they can show that your judgment is compromised, that you're making financial decisions driven by emotional attachment to a woman you hired, they can challenge your position from inside the political alliances that keep this organization protected. And the engagement," Damien said slowly, "is their insurance. If I move against Felix directly, Vivienne ends the engagement publicly, frames it as Damien Vescari retaliating against a family that tried to protect him from his own instability." He looked up. "It's actually elegant." "Yes, sir," Carver said, with the tone of a man who can appreciate craftsmanship even when it's pointed at him. Damien stood up from the desk again. This time he moved to the board on the wall and looked at the photographs and lines and names with new eyes, rearranging what he knew against what he'd just learned. He was quiet for several minutes. Carver didn't fill the silence. "How long do we have before Felix makes his next move?" Damien asked. "The political allies he's been courting, he'll want their commitments before he acts. I'd estimate 3 weeks, maybe less if he's read Riordan's exit as a sign that we're aware." "He's read it," Damien said. "Riordan will tell him, not because he wants to, because Felix will ask and Riordan still thinks being honest with him is a form of management. He looked at the board. Move the timeline to 10 days. Carver nodded. And Mrs. Hart and the child? Damien turned from the board. I want them inside the main house, both of them, today. I'll speak to Mrs. Aldrin. He looked at Carver. Put 2 men on the east gate and 1 on the garden access. Don't make it visible to them. I don't want Elena spending her days afraid. Carver left. Damien went to find Elena. She was in the kitchen with Lily, who was sitting at the table doing something with crayons and paper with the focused application of someone running out of time to finish a project. Elena was at the counter, not doing anything, standing with a cup of coffee and looking at nothing, the specific stillness of a person processing things they haven't said yet. She looked up when he came in. Read his face the way she'd gotten surprisingly fast at reading his face in 3 weeks. How bad? She said. I'm moving you to the main house, the guest suite on the 2nd floor, today. She set her cup down. Damien, it's not a discussion, he said, then caught the edge in his own voice and adjusted. I'll explain everything, but the move needs to happen first. Lily looked up from her crayons. She'd been listening the way children listen when adults think they're not, quietly, with her whole body slightly oriented toward the conversation. She held up her paper. It was a drawing. A house, crayon green and yellow, 2 figures in front of it, and beside them, clearly identifiable by its wobbly stem, a sunflower. I made it for the new room, she said, so it doesn't feel strange. Damien looked at the drawing for a moment. Thank you, he said. His voice was even. His hands were still. Lily went back to coloring the sky. Blue first, then, after considering it, a streak of orange. Elena was watching him from across the kitchen with an expression that asked everything she wasn't asking out loud. He told her in the study, once Lily was settled with Mrs. Aldrin for the afternoon. He told her about Reardon and the 8 weeks and the photograph of Vivian and Felix in the parking garage and the case they were building. He told her what Carver had said about the competence argument, about the engagement as insurance, about the 10-day window. He told her all of it, which surprised him while he was doing it, the act of telling it, the impulse toward transparency with a person he'd known for 3 weeks, a person who'd come here for a job and stayed for reasons neither of them had fully articulated. He registered the surprise but didn't stop. Elena listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at the desk, and then she said, Vivian, when she warned me, do you think she knew what her father was planning? The call to my phone, using Lily as leverage? I think she knew the general shape of it, Damien said. Whether she knew the specifics, he paused. She's not a stupid woman. She knew enough to warn you before it happened. That's not warning me, Elena said. That's covering herself. There's a difference. He looked at her. Yes, there is. So what happens in 10 days, she asked. Felix makes his move politically. He presents the competence argument to the coalition. I need to have already moved before that. Built a counter case. Locked down the alliances he's been courting. Exposed the financial manipulation at the heart of the engagement contract. He looked at the board. It's doable. It requires every piece to land in the right order. And if one piece doesn't, then it gets louder and faster than I'd like. Elena looked at him steadily. Lily and I are the piece that doesn't fit, she said. Our being here is the argument he's using against you. If we left, we've covered this. We covered it before I knew the full picture. She leaned forward slightly. I'm not afraid of staying, Damien. I need you to understand that I'm not looking for an exit, but I need to know that you've actually thought it through and not just decided it because... She stopped. Because what? She met his eyes. Because the last time you loved something, you lost it to a car bomb. And now there's a child in your garden every morning and you're not thinking as clearly as you think you are. The room was very quiet. Damien looked at her for a long moment. He didn't look away, and she didn't look away. And the silence stretched between them with the particular tension of 2 people who have just said something truer than they'd planned. I've thought it through, he said, both as the man I am now and as the man I was before I became him. He paused. You and Lily leaving doesn't remove you from the board. It makes you a target that I'm not positioned to protect. It hands Felix leverage he can use in a different way, not as evidence of my distraction, but as evidence that I drive people away, that my judgment is so compromised people around me are running. He kept his voice level. You're safer here. Lily is safer here. That's the clear-headed version. Elena looked at him for a moment longer. Then, "All right. You believe me?" "I believe you believe it," she said. "And I also think you're right." She stood. "Tell me what I can do." He almost said nothing. The instinct of a man who has spent 3 years keeping everything internal, routing everything through systems and intermediaries and the cold logistics of operational control. But he caught it. "Right now, keep Lily's routine as close to normal as possible. The garden, the mornings, the structure. Don't let her feel the change." Elena nodded. She moved toward the door and then stopped, her hand on the frame. "The drawing she made. Put it up in here somewhere. She'll look for it." He looked at the wall beside the window where Sophia's sunflower already hung. "All right," he said. Elena left. He stood in the study alone for a moment. Then he took Lily's drawing from the desk where he'd set it and found a space on the wall, not replacing Sophia's, not competing with it, but beside it. 2 sunflowers. One in yellow crayon from 3 years ago, one in yellow and orange from this afternoon, both wobbly stemmed, both made by a 4-year-old's hand. He stood back and looked at them together for a long time. Then he went back to work. The 10 days compressed to 7. The first sign was a call to Carver from one of the coalition partners Damien had been cultivating, a man named Aldrich, who ran a shipping concern that overlapped with 3 of Damien's legitimate enterprises and who had been a reliable, if cautious, ally for 6 years. Aldrich's message was brief. He was pulling back from a meeting they'd scheduled, citing scheduling conflicts, the formal language of a man who'd been spoken to. Damien noted it, moved faster. The second sign came from a lawyer in the city, one who worked the intersection of organized money and legitimate politics, the kind of man who knew where everything was buried because he'd helped bury most of it, who sent, through a circuitous route that took 4 intermediaries, a single-sentence message. Felix DeLuca filed a sealed financial complaint with the Oversight Board yesterday. It cites emotional incapacity. They were 7 days out, and Felix had already filed. Damien called Carver into the study at midnight and stood at the board and said, "Change of approach." "Sir, we don't counter the complaint. We make the complaint irrelevant." He pointed to 3 names on the board. "These 3, Aldrich, Brennan, the Weston Group. Felix has already gotten to them. We're not going to win them back in time and trying to will telegraph our position." He moved his hand. "But these 4 haven't committed. These 4 are the coalition's balance point. If we lock them in the next 48 hours, Felix doesn't have the numbers he needs to make the complaint stick. It becomes a grievance from an interested party instead of a consensus motion." Carver studied the board. "The Weston Group will want something. I know what they want. I've been holding it back because giving it to them means restructuring the harbor arrangement. I'll give it to them." He looked at Carver. "Set the meetings, all 4, next 2 days, wherever they want, whenever they want. And Felix, he'll see you moving. Let him." Damien turned from the board. "I want him to see it. I want him to know the complaint isn't going to land the way he planned. Because when he panics—" He stopped. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite cold and wasn't quite angry, but lived in the space between them. "When he panics, he'll make a move he hasn't planned, and that's when he'll show me the rest of what he's been building. The pieces I haven't seen yet." Carver nodded slowly. "You want him to overreach. I'm counting on it." Carver left to make calls. Damien stood at the board alone in the quiet of the house at midnight, and from somewhere below and across the corridor he heard, faint enough that he might have imagined it, a child's voice talking softly to something. The plant on the windowsill of the guest suite, he supposed, or the rabbit, or maybe nothing at all, maybe just Lily narrating the dark the way children do when they're teaching themselves not to be afraid of it. He stood and listened to it for a moment. Then he turned back to the board. Felix made his move on day 4. Not the political move, that was still being assembled, the paperwork traveling through the proper channels at the speed of institutional process. Felix made a different move, a faster one, the kind you make when you've realized the chessboard is shifting and you need to change the game entirely. Vivienne arrived at the estate unannounced at 3 in the afternoon. No call, no car announcement at the gate. She'd somehow come through the east access, which meant someone had given her the code, which meant the 2-day-old perimeter security had a hole in it that Damien was going to find and close the moment this conversation was over. She walked into the main hall and found Elena coming down the stairs with a basket of laundry, and she stopped and looked at her and said, in a voice that had shed all its previous precision. "Where is he?" Elena looked at her. "I'll let him know you're here." "I know you will. That's not what I asked." Elena set the basket down on the landing and looked at her with the particular stillness of a woman who has decided she's done being careful. "Study. Down the west corridor, second door." Vivian moved past her without another word. Damien heard her coming, the specific quality of her footsteps when she was angry, something he'd learned over 18 months of engagement, because you learn these things, the physical vocabulary of the people in your life. And he was already standing when she opened the study door without knocking. She looked at the board on the wall, the photographs, the names, the lines. She looked at it for a moment with an expression that moved through recognition into something harder. Then she looked at the two drawings beside the window. Then she looked at him. "My father filed this morning," she said, "not the date you were expecting." "I know," Damien said. "I knew yesterday." "Then you know what he included." She crossed her arms. Not defensive, the posture of someone holding themselves together from the outside. "He included transcripts, Damien. Phone transcripts. Not from Riordan, from me." Damien went very still. "3 conversations," Vivian said. "He recorded them without my knowledge. Or, he says without my knowledge. The transcripts show me describing your behavior over the past month. Your change in routine. Your attachment to the child. The fact that you reordered the flowers." Her voice was steady, and she was working hard to keep it that way. Out of context, they read exactly the way he intended them to read. "You gave him the evidence," Damien said. "I talked to my father," she said, and something cracked slightly in her voice before she pulled it back. "I talked to my father about the man I'm engaged to because I was genuinely concerned, not strategically, concerned." She looked at him. He used it. Damien looked at her for a long moment. He was thinking about the parking garage photograph. He was thinking about Carver's theory, covering herself, not warning Elena. He was thinking about how easy it would be to decide she'd known exactly what her father would do. He was also thinking about the way her voice had almost cracked on the word concerned. "Did you know about the call to Elena?" he asked. "The one using Lily as leverage." Her expression shifted, something that might have been genuine revulsion. "No. I knew he was going to make things uncomfortable. I didn't know he'd go after a 4-year-old. She paused. "When I warned her, Elena, I was trying to give her a way out before things got worse. I know how that looks now, I know. It looks like positioning." "I know what it looks like." She met his eyes. "I'm telling you what it was." He looked at her for a long moment. Then, "Your father has the transcripts, the financial complaint, and 3 days to have it in front of the oversight board before my counter moves land." He paused. "What does he plan to do with you?" A beat. "I'm the announcement," she said. "He's going to have me publicly end the engagement, frame it as me leaving because I'm genuinely concerned about your capacity to lead. The betrayed fiancée who tried to hold things together as long as she could." Her mouth twisted. "He thinks I'll do it because I have no choice, because he recorded those conversations, and if I refuse, the narrative becomes that I'm complicit in whatever he decides to say about me." "Are you going to do it?" Vivian looked at him. Then she looked at the wall, the board, the names, the 2 crayon sunflowers. She looked at all of it for a moment with an expression he couldn't fully read, some composite of calculation and exhaustion, and something more personal underneath both. "I came here," she said. "So no, I'm not going to do it." She looked back at him. "But I need you to understand what that means. If I refuse him, I become a liability to his plan. And my father doesn't leave liabilities unmanaged." The implication settled into the room. Damien looked at Carver's position by the door, looked at the board, looked at the clock. 3 days. "Stay in the house tonight," he said to Vivian. She looked startled, not the reaction she'd prepared for. "What?" "Stay in the house. Don't contact your father. Don't go back to your apartment." He moved to his desk. "If Felix decides you're a liability before we've moved, you're safer here than anywhere he knows about." He looked up. "This is not reconciliation. This is logistics. Can you understand the difference?" She looked at him for a moment. Then something that might, under different circumstances, have been described as dry amusement moved across her face. "I spent 18 months being engaged to you. I understand the difference very well." He almost said something. Didn't. She left the study to find Mrs. Aldrin. Damien turned to the board and recalculated every timeline, every position, every piece on the board in light of what he now knew. That Felix had recordings, that the complaint was filed early, that Vivian was refusing to play her role, and that the man who'd planned this entire sequence with the patience of someone who'd been waiting for years was now looking at a situation where two of his primary instruments had failed him. And then his phone rang. Carver. Not a call Carver would make unless it was urgent. Damien picked up. Eastgate camera, Carver said, no preamble. 20 minutes ago, a car, 2 men. They didn't come in. They stopped, took pictures of the gate, drove away. Plates? Clean, rental, cash paid. A pause. They also had a clear sight line to the garden from the east road. Lily was out there at the time. Damien's hand tightened on the phone. Where is she now? He said. The control in his voice cost him something. Inside. Mrs. Aldrin brought her in for a snack 10 minutes before the car showed up. She didn't see them. Elena? Second floor. She doesn't know yet. Damien stood at the window of his study and looked out at the drive and felt something happen in his chest that wasn't quite fear but was its closest neighbor. The specific cold clarity of a man who has just understood that what he was afraid of has already begun to materialize. Felix wasn't waiting 3 days. The political move was the distraction. What he was actually doing was something faster and uglier and more direct, and a car stopping at the east gate to photograph it. And established sight lines was not reconnaissance for a political argument. It was reconnaissance for something else entirely. Damien put down the phone. He moved to the door of the study and then stopped and turned back and looked at the wall. The board with its names and lines, Sophia's drawing, Lily's drawing beside it, 2 wobbly sunflowers in the afternoon light. He thought about what he'd told Elena. When he panics, he'll make a move he hasn't planned, and that's when he'll show me the rest of what he's been building. He hadn't panicked. He'd been wrong about that. Felix DeLuca hadn't panicked at all. He had simply decided, with the cold efficiency of a man who had always been willing to do what others weren't, that the cleanest way to destroy Damien Viscari's capacity to function wasn't a political complaint, or a financial case, or a public broken engagement. It was to take the thing Damien had just started to let himself need again, and remove it. Damien walked out of the study and down the corridor toward the sound of his housekeeper's daughter somewhere on the floor above, and he began giving orders that would change the shape of everything. He moved through the house like a different man. Not louder. Damien had never been loud, but the quality of his silence had changed. It was the silence of something that had been holding itself in reserve and had stopped. He went up the stairs 2 at a time and found Elena in the guest suite folding laundry with the window open, the afternoon light cutting across the floor, and she looked up when he came through the door and read his face in the half-second before he spoke. Something happened, she said. A car at the east gate. 2 men. They had a sight line to the garden. He looked at her steadily. Lily was outside. Elena's hand stopped moving. The shirt she'd been folding stayed half-folded. Was she? She's fine. She was inside before they arrived. She didn't see them. He came further into the room. I need you to listen to me carefully. What I'm going to tell you is not a precaution. It's an assessment. She set the shirt down. Tell me. Felix isn't running the political play as his primary move. He's running it as cover. What he's actually doing is faster and more direct, and a car photographing the gate means he's past the planning stage. He looked at her. He's going to try to take Lily. The room went very quiet. Elena didn't collapse. She didn't make a sound. She stood at the foot of the bed with her hands at her sides and went through something internal that lasted about 4 seconds and came out the other side with her jaw set and her eyes clear in the way eyes get clear when a person has decided that fear is not a useful tool right now. Where is she? Elena said. Kitchen with Mrs. Aldrin. I have 2 men at the east corridor entrance. He paused. I'm moving both of you to the interior rooms. No windows facing the perimeter. Tonight. And then? Tonight I find out exactly what Felix is planning and how fast, and then we move first. Elena looked at him. How do you move first against a man who already has people at your gate? By being somewhere he doesn't expect when he expects you somewhere else. He held her gaze. I need you to trust me for the next 12 hours. Not unconditionally. Ask me anything you need to ask. But trust that I am not going to let anything happen to her. Elena looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light moved across the floor between them. I know you won't, she said. Not performed, just fact. He went back downstairs. Carver had 3 men repositioned within the hour. Eastgate, garden access, the service road that ran behind the property's north wall. Damien stood in the front hall and watched Carver coordinate with the focused efficiency of a man who understood exactly what was at stake without needing it, explained and felt, beneath the operational clarity, something that was cold and deep and old. The specific cold of a man who had already lost a child to someone else's calculation and was standing in the exact shape of that moment again. He didn't let it show. He used it instead, the way you use pain when there's nothing else available. As fuel, as focus, as the thing that keeps your hands from shaking when everything else says they should. Mrs. Aldrin brought Lily to the interior sitting room at 4 o'clock. Lily came in carrying her rabbit and a fistful of crayons and looked around at the room with the adaptable curiosity of a child who had already moved twice in her short life and understood that rooms change, but the things you carry with you don't. "Are we staying in here tonight?" she asked. "For a bit," Damien said. She considered this. "Can I bring the plant?" "Yes." She seemed satisfied. She settled onto the rug and began drawing, the crayons spread around her in a radius, with the rabbit propped against the leg of the coffee table as an audience. Damien stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment. The complete absorption of it, the way she held her tongue slightly between her teeth when she was concentrating. And then he turned and went to find Vivienne. She was in the east sitting room with a glass of water she hadn't touched, standing at the window with her back to the door. She turned when he came in. "Your father made his move," he said. "Not the complaint, something else." Vivienne looked at him. "How bad?" "Bad enough that I need to know everything. Not the outline, everything. Every conversation you had with him about me in the last 3 months. Every specific thing he asked about, and every specific thing you told him." He held her gaze. "Including things you thought were harmless." She looked at him for a moment, then moved to the chair and sat down and began talking. It took 40 minutes. She was precise, more precise than he'd expected. Her memory for the texture of conversations, almost architectural, the way certain people's minds work when they've spent their lives in rooms where words are weapons. She told him about the first conversation in October when her father had asked, seemingly casually, about Damien's daily routine. She told him about the dinner in November where Felix had asked specifically about Damien's emotional state, framing it as paternal concern, and how she'd described the grief. The stopped clocks, the sealed garden, the way Damien moved through his own house like a visitor. She told him about the call in December where Felix had said, with the particular warmth of a man who has already decided what he's going to do, that he was worried about Damien's capacity to protect people around him. Damien listened to all of it without moving. "The capacity to protect people around him," he repeated. Vivienne looked at him. He was establishing the framework. If something happened to someone connected to you, if someone got hurt, it would confirm the incompetence argument, and he'd already have the transcript where I described you as emotionally unstable. She paused. He didn't need the political complaint to go through. He just needed the narrative to exist before the event. "So the complaint is documentation," Damien said, "after the fact." "Yes." He looked at the window. Outside the light was going, the property going gray and long-shadowed in the late afternoon. He thought about the car at the gate, about sightlines and timing and how long it takes to move from reconnaissance to action when you're a man with resources and patience and no one inside your organization has defected to warn the target in time. "He's going to move tonight," Damien said. Vivienne went very still. "You're sure?" "The car was today. The complaint was filed yesterday. He's been building this for months, and Reardon's exit told him the countermove is coming. If he waits, the window closes." He looked at her. "Tonight." She stood up. "Then we need to—" "I need you to do something," he said. "Exactly one thing, and it has to be done now." She looked at him. "Call your father," he said. "Tell him you've made your decision, that you're ending the engagement, that you'll make the statement tomorrow, public, exactly the way he wants it framed." He held her gaze. "Tell him you're leaving the estate tonight." The implication arrived in her face slowly, in sequence. "You want him to think the operation is clear. I want him to know you're gone. If you're out of the house, he doesn't have to worry about you being caught in whatever he's planned. It makes him comfortable. Comfortable men don't check their assumptions." He paused. "You're not leaving." But he needs to believe you are. Vivian looked at him for a long moment. Something compression. The calculation, yes, but underneath it something more personal. The look of a woman being asked to be useful in a way that requires her to pretend she's done exactly what part of her considered doing. And my father, she said quietly, when this is over. He answers for what he's built, Damien said. I won't protect him. I won't give you that. She nodded, once. I didn't ask you to. She picked up her phone. He left her to make the call. Carver found him in the study at 6, and the look on his face was the look of a man delivering news he'd verified 3 times because he didn't want to be wrong about it. We got a trace on the rental car, Carver said. It was rented through a company that connects to a logistics operation Felix has used before. We ran the driver through facial recognition from the gate camera. He paused. The driver is a man named Soto. He worked for Felix's private security operation for 6 years. He left 14 months ago, officially. Unofficially, Soto operates as a contractor for jobs Felix doesn't want connected to his name. What kind of jobs? Damien said. He already knew. The kind that require someone who doesn't mind if things get complicated, Carver said carefully. Damien sat with that for a moment. Then, how many men does Soto typically run? In operations like this? 6 to 8. He prefers the port warehouses on the south side for staging. Felix owns 3 of them through a shell company. Damien looked at the board, looked at the clock. It was 6:14 in the evening. Where's Lily right now? Interior sitting room. Mrs. Aldrin and one of our men at the door. Elena? With her. He looked at the board for another moment, running the geometry of it. Soto's operational pattern, the port warehouses, the route from the south side to the estate, the timing. A man like Soto would move after dark, which gave them 3 hours. Maybe less. I want to change the shape of this, Damien said. Instead of waiting for them to come here, I want to know exactly where Soto is staging, and I want to be there first. Carver looked at him steadily. With what objective? Control the location. Control the engagement. He turned from the board. If Soto comes to this house, the fight is here, around Elena and Lily and everyone else in these walls. If I go to where he's staging, it's a different conversation. It's also walking toward 8 armed men. Yes. Damien picked up his jacket from the chair. Get me 4 people. Your best 4. People who don't need to be told what we're doing. They just need to know where. Carver looked at him for a half-second longer than necessary. Not hesitation, just the look of a man measuring the thing being asked. And then he nodded and reached for his phone. Damien went to the interior sitting room. Elena looked up from the floor where she'd been sitting with Lily, both of them cross-legged on the rug with the crayons between them. Lily had been drawing something she'd covered with her arm when the door opened, the instinct of an artist protecting her work. And then she saw it was Damien and uncovered it. It was the garden. The stone path and the flower beds and the green chute, which in Lily's rendering was already as tall as the fence, which was aspirational but not unreasonable for a 4-year-old's timeline. We're making it how it's going to look, Lily said, when everything grows. I can see that. He crouched down to her level. I need to go out for a while tonight. I need you to stay in here with your mother and Mrs. Aldrin. Lily looked at him with those eyes. Is it because of the sad thing? He paused. What sad thing? The thing that's making everyone walk different. She tilted her head. You all walk like something heavy is on you. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, yes, it's because of that. Looked at her steadily. I'm going to go take care of it, and when I come back, we're going to figure out how tall that chute actually is. Lily considered this. Then she held out the rabbit. He looked at it. For luck, she said, with the serious pragmatism of someone making a logical decision. He took the rabbit. He held it for a moment, this small, worn cloth thing with one ear slightly longer than the other, and felt the weight of it, which was almost nothing physically and enormous in every other way. And then he put it in his jacket pocket. Thank you, he said. He stood and looked at Elena. She was on her feet now. She'd been watching the exchange with her hands quiet at her sides and her face very controlled, and she met his eyes with the specific look of a woman who has something to say and has decided not to say it because the timing is wrong, but who needs him to know it's there. He knew it was there. Come back, she said. Just that. Yes, he said. He left. The drive to the South Port took 22 minutes. Carver was in the passenger seat, 2 cars following with 4 men total. Nobody talked. The city moved past the windows in its nighttime version. Lights, wet streets from an earlier rain, the particular emptiness of industrial areas after hours. Damien held the rabbit in his jacket pocket the entire drive. I didn't think about it. It was just there, a small warm pressure against his ribs. Carver got a location confirmation at 8:47. A contact inside the Port Authority, who owed a debt that had nothing to do with any of this, had eyes on a staging area in Warehouse 3, Felix's shell company's property, and counted 7 men and a vehicle. 7 men. Soto plus 6. They're not staged for extraction yet, the contact said, through Carver's earpiece, which Damien could hear from the driver's seat. They're waiting on a signal. Waiting for confirmation that Vivian's gone, Damien said. Carver relayed. The contact confirmed timing, but probably another 40 minutes before they moved. Then we have 30, Damien said. They came in through the north loading dock. Damien moved the way he'd moved a long time ago, before the grief and the 3 years of stillness, when his body had known this particular kind of forward motion. Low, controlled, each step placed rather than taken, the specific discipline of a man who'd been trained to be very quiet in very large spaces. Carver was 2 steps behind him. The other 4 fanned into position at the perimeter. They were inside the warehouse before Soto's men heard anything. What followed was not clean. Real things are not clean. 2 of Felix's men went down fast. They'd been positioned badly, alert but not alert enough, watching the south axis when the north was where the problem came from. The 3rd caught Carver across the shoulder with something that wasn't a bullet, but left him swearing in a way Damien had never heard from him before. The 4th and 5th retreated toward the back of the warehouse, which was the wrong direction because Damien's other 4 had the perimeter. Soto himself was at the center of the warehouse, beside a black SUV with the engine already idling, and when he saw Damien, he did something unexpected. He stopped. Just stopped, in the middle of whatever motion he'd been making, and looked at Damien with the flat assessment of a professional encountering another professional and adjusting his threat model in real time. Viscari, he said. Not surprised. Not afraid. Just noting it. Soto. Damien was breathing hard from the crossing. He didn't have a gun in his hand. He'd made that choice deliberately, the choice to come into this space in a way that required Soto to also choose. Call it off. Soto tilted his head very slightly. Around the warehouse, things were going quiet in the way things go quiet when people realize the math has changed. Felix is going to be very unhappy. Felix is going to be in a federal holding facility by this time tomorrow, Damien said. He filed a financial complaint with a regulatory board, and I have 3 regulators who are going to find it extremely interesting when they examine his own accounts in response. He kept his eyes on Soto. Whatever he's paying you, he's not going to be in a position to make good on it. Soto was quiet for a moment. He was calculating. Damien could see it. The clean, depersonalized arithmetic of a contractor reassessing a contract when the client's position becomes untenable. The kid, Soto said. We weren't going to hurt her. I know, Damien said, though he didn't know, not entirely. Call it off. Another moment. Then Soto made a small gesture with his right hand, open palm, fingers spread, and around the warehouse the remaining men stood down with the immediate compliance of people who follow nonverbal signals from someone they trust. Damien exhaled. He didn't let it show. Smart, Carver said from behind him, with the strained quality of a man managing a shoulder injury while trying to sound professional. Get your men out of here, Damien said to Soto. Tell Felix whatever you need to tell him, tonight. Soto looked at him for a moment longer. Then he moved, not toward Damien, around him, toward the side exit, and his men followed in the quiet, practiced way of people who know how to leave a situation. Within 3 minutes, the warehouse was empty, except for Damien's people. Damien stood in the center of the warehouse and felt his heart rate begin to descend from where it had been, and breathed the damp air of the port, and looked at the idling SUV. He reached into his pocket and took out the rabbit and looked at it in the warehouse light. One ear slightly longer than the other, a small worn patch on its right side where Lily held it. He put it back in his pocket. Carver, he said. Sir. Carver had his hand pressed to his shoulder, not bleeding badly, probably bruised, maybe cracked. He'd live. He was already annoyed about it, which was a good sign. Make the calls, Damien said. The regulators, the 3 alliance partners, the lawyer. Tonight, not tomorrow. It's 9:30. I know what time it is. Carver reached for his phone with his good arm. Damien was already moving toward the exit. The drive back took longer. There was a delay at the port road, some kind of freight traffic moving in the opposite direction, and they sat in it for 8 minutes while Damien watched the darkness outside the window and felt the rabbit in his pocket, and thought about Lily asking if they could fix the garden, and Elena standing at the window of the east corridor with her coffee going cold in her hand. His phone rang at 9:51. Unknown number, the second one in this story, and he answered it because he'd learned from the first one. It was Felix. His voice was smooth, unhurried, the voice of a man who has not yet fully processed that his plan has failed, or who is processing it and choosing not to show that. Damien, I understand there was some confusion at the port tonight. No confusion, Damien said. My people were. Your people are gone, and Soto is calling you right now to tell you the same thing I'm about to tell you. Damien looked out the window at the wet city. You filed a financial complaint that's going to come back to you with interest. You ran a targeted operation against a 4-year-old child. You bribed my second-in-command, which I can prove. And you've been running a coordinated campaign to destabilize my organization, which I can prove in more detail than you'd like. He paused. I'm going to let the regulatory process handle the first item. The rest, I'll handle myself. And I want you to think very carefully about what that means. A silence on the line. Vivian made her choice, Felix said. His voice had shifted, still controlled, but thinner. She'll regret it. What she'll regret, Damien said, is that she believed you'd protect her. She won't make that mistake again. He paused. And Felix, the girl, if anyone from your orbit comes within a visible distance of that child, I'll stop being interested in regulatory processes entirely. Are we clear? Another silence. Longer. Clear, Felix said and hung up. Damien put the phone in his pocket beside the rabbit and looked at the road ahead as the traffic finally began to move. Carver glanced at him from the passenger seat. His shoulder was making him hold himself at a slight angle, but he was managing it with the stoicism of a man who'd been hit worse. How do you think he takes it? He's a patient man, Damien said. He'll spend a week telling himself he can recover the position. Then he'll spend another week realizing he can't. Then he'll spend whatever time the regulators give him trying to minimize damage. He paused. He's done. And Reardon? Damien looked at the road. Reardon's done too. Differently. He thought about the driveway. 40 minutes. No words. He gets to leave quietly. That's more than the math says he deserves. Carver nodded. He didn't push it. They pulled through the estate gates at 10:20. The property was lit the way Damien had ordered it. Interior lights, nothing showing from the perimeter, the quiet controlled presence of men at their positions without broadcasting it. He was out of the car before it fully stopped. Mrs. Aldrin met him in the front hall. They're in the interior sitting room, she said, before he could ask. Both of them. Lily fell asleep on the rug about an hour ago. Elena's been... She paused, choosing the word. Present. He went down the corridor. He opened the sitting room door quietly. Lily was asleep on the rug exactly as Mrs. Aldrin had said, the crayons scattered around her, her drawing of the future garden still visible at the edge of the spread paper. She'd curled on her side with her coat as a blanket, her knees pulled up, looking smaller in sleep than she did awake, which was the particular vulnerability of children sleeping in places they'd decided were safe enough. Elena was in the chair beside her. She'd been sitting forward, elbows on her knees, the posture of a woman in a waiting room. When the door opened, she stood up in one motion, eyes going to his face before anything else. He held up the rabbit. She looked at the rabbit, then at him. Then the specific control she'd been maintaining for the past 4 hours did something. Didn't collapse, didn't break, but shifted, the way a held breath shifts when you finally release it. And she crossed the room and took the rabbit from his hand and held it against her chest, and stood very close to him without saying anything for a moment. It's over? She said quietly. The immediate part, he said. The rest takes a few weeks, but tonight, yes. She nodded. She looked at Lily on the rug. She made me promise she'd be asleep when you got back. She didn't want to watch the door. He looked at the sleeping child, at the drawing. at the scattered crayons in their radius. "She's practical," he said. "She is." Elena looked up at him. Her face was very close. The sitting room was quiet around them, the only sound Lily's even breathing, and somewhere outside the distant sound of Carver issuing quiet instructions to his men. "Damien." "Yeah." "Don't do that again without telling me more." He looked at her. "More than what?" "More than come back." She held his gaze. "I'm not a person you need to protect from information. I've been managing information and outcomes on my own for 14 months, and I did it without falling apart." Her voice was low and even and entirely serious. "Next time, tell me what you're actually going into." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "All right." "All right," she said. She stepped back. "Not far, just enough." She looked at Lily. "Help me get her to bed." He crouched down beside the sleeping child and gathered her up. She was lighter than he expected, the boneless total weight of a sleeping child, her head falling against his shoulder without waking. And he carried her out of the sitting room and up the stairs toward the guest suite, Elena walking beside him, one hand resting lightly on Lily's back as they went. Lily stirred at the top of the stairs. Didn't wake, not fully, but her eyes opened to the half-mast of a child surfacing briefly from deep sleep, and she registered the shoulder she was on and the face above her with the drowsy, uncritical acceptance of someone whose body has decided this is fine before her mind can intervene. "Did you fix it?" she murmured. "Working on it," he said. She settled back against him. "The rabbit helped," she said, already going back under. He laid her in the bed, and Elena pulled the cover over her, and they stood on opposite sides of the bed for a moment, looking at the sleeping child between them. The rabbit back in its position under her arm, the quiet breathing, the complete defenses down. Peace of a child who has decided the world is safe enough for tonight. Then Elena looked across the bed at him. Her face in the low light was tired and real and not performing anything. He looked back at her. Down the hall, a door opened and closed. Mrs. Aldrin or Carver, someone managing the house the way it needed managing. Somewhere outside, a car moved along the perimeter road on its quiet rotation. The estate breathed around them, watchful and intact. On the ground floor, in the interior sitting room, Lily's drawing of the future garden lay on the rug where she'd left it. The stone path, the flower beds, the chute already as tall as the fence, two figures standing in front of a house that looked nothing like a mausoleum and everything like a home. And in the hallway outside the guest suite, a phone rang in Carver's pocket, the lawyer, the regulators, the machinery of consequence beginning to turn. And Carver answered it in a low voice and moved away down the corridor, because some things needed to be in motion before morning, and morning was not far. The lawyer called at 6:14 in the morning. Damien was already awake. He'd slept 3 hours in the chair in his study, which was more than he'd expected. And he answered on the first ring and listened while the lawyer, a precise man named Holt, who charged rates that reflected his precision, walked him through what the regulatory board had found when they opened Felix DeLuca's financial records in response to the complaint Felix himself had filed. It took 11 minutes. Damien listened without interrupting. When Holt finished, Damien said, "How long before it's sealed?" 48 hours for this preliminary freeze. The full investigation, months. But the freeze is what matters. He can't move anything, can't liquidate, can't transfer. He's contained. A pause. He also can't fund any further operational activities, if that's a relevant consideration. "It's a relevant consideration," Damien said. "Thank you, Holt." He put the phone down and sat in the early morning quiet of his study and looked at the board on the wall and at the two drawings beside the window, and felt, for the first time in 3 years, something that was not the absence of something else. Not the absence of grief. Not the absence of fear. Not the absence of forward momentum. Something with its own weight and texture. He wasn't sure yet what to call it. He went to the kitchen and made coffee. Mrs. Aldrin found him there at 7 and looked at the coffee and at his face and said, "Well?" Felix's accounts are frozen as of this morning. Carver's men confirmed Soto left the city last night. The 3 alliance partners signed their commitments before midnight. He poured a second cup and set it at her usual place at the counter. "It's contained." Mrs. Aldrin sat on her stool and picked up the cup and drank from it without ceremony. "And Reardon?" "Gone." He left the city yesterday evening. I had Carver confirm it. He looked at his own cup. He took nothing that wasn't his, and he didn't make contact with Felix before he left. That's the best version of how that ends. Mrs. Aldrin was quiet for a moment. He sat in that driveway with you for 40 minutes. I know. People are more than their worst decision. I know that too. He looked at the window. The garden was gray in the early light, the raised beds just visible, the stone path wet from overnight dew. I didn't have him removed. I gave him the choice to go. That's the most I could do and still be honest about what he'd done. Mrs. Aldrin drank her coffee. Fair, she said. Lily appeared at 7:30 in her rubber boots and coat over her pajamas, the rabbit under one arm, and the child-sized gardening gloves already on, which meant she'd put them on before she'd fully woken up, by instinct, the way some people reach for their phone first thing, and Lily reached for the tools of a project she'd decided mattered. She stopped when she saw Damien at the counter. You're here, she said. I live here, he said. I know, but you're usually not in the kitchen this early. She looked at him with her morning assessment eyes. Did you fix the sad thing? He considered. Most of it. She seemed to accept the honesty of most. I'm going to the garden. I'll come. She looked at him. This registered as significant. He could see it in the slight adjustment of her posture, the way children adjust when something they've wanted but not asked for is unexpectedly offered. She didn't make it a big thing. She just turned and went out the east corridor door, and he put down his coffee and followed her. The garden in the early morning was cold and damp and smelled like wet soil and the particular green smell of things that are growing without caring whether you notice. Lily went directly to the back wall where the chute was. Taller now, nearly 8 inches, with 4 proper leaves and the beginning of a 5th, and crouched beside it and looked at it the way she looked at it every morning, with the focused attention of someone taking attendance. Damien stood on the stone path and looked at the garden around him. The raised beds, the rusted iron bench his wife had picked out from a salvage yard in the 2nd year of their marriage because she'd said the new ones looked too careful. The shape of the bed she'd designed, not geometric, not symmetrical, the organic shape of someone who'd drawn them freehand because freehand felt more alive. He hadn't stood in this garden in daylight in 3 years. He'd come at night sometimes, stood at the edge of it, in the dark, and gone back inside. He hadn't been able to come in the daylight with all the evidence of what it had been and wasn't anymore. He came in now. He walked to the iron bench and sat down on it, the metal cold through his jacket, and looked at the beds around him. Lily glanced over her shoulder at him. Then she went back to the chute. It's going to be a sunflower, she said. A real one. A big one. I know, your mother told me what you found. I didn't find it, she said, with the precision of someone correcting a factual error. It found itself. I just noticed. He looked at her. At the back of her head, the small shoulders in the coat, the rubber boots planted on either side of the chute as she tended it. He thought about Sophia talking to the sunflowers. He thought about how he'd told Elena he didn't know whether they could hear her. He still didn't know. He was still not qualified to say. But he sat on the bench in the garden his wife had made and watched a 4-year-old tend something that had survived 3 years of neglect by deciding not to give up, and he thought that the question of whether or not it could hear probably wasn't the point. He stayed in the garden until Elena came looking for them at 8:15. She appeared at the gate in her regular clothes, not yet in her work things, her hair not fully settled, a woman who had come outside without completing her morning because she'd checked the interior sitting room and the kitchen and the east corridor and then looked out the window. She looked at Lily at the back wall and at Damien on the bench and at the two of them in the garden together in the early gray light, and she stood at the gate for a moment without coming in. Breakfast, she said, which was the word she'd meant to say. 5 more minutes, Lily said, which was what she always said. Elena looked at Damien. He looked back at her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. They'd gotten good, in the past weeks, at the particular language of looked at each other, the things that got communicated without requiring the machinery of words. 5 minutes, Elena said, and went back inside. Damien stood up from the bench. He looked at Sophia's garden around him. That was how he thought of it. That was how he'd always thought of it. Sophia's, not in the sense of excluding everything else, but in the sense that she was the one who'd loved it first. And he registered, for the first time without the specific accompanying pain that had kept him from this place, that the garden was still here, that it had continued existing through 3 years of his absence, that the shoot at the back wall had not cared about his grief or his reasons or his sealed interior life. It had simply pressed upward because that was its nature. He thought his wife would have found that funny. She'd had that quality, finding the stubborn persistence of things genuinely amusing rather than sentimental. She would have said something dry about it. He couldn't remember exactly how her voice had sounded anymore, which was one of the specific losses that accumulated over 3 years, the way the high-resolution version of a person fades, even when the love doesn't. But he could still remember the quality of her humor, the angle of it, that was still there. "Mr. Damien," Lily said. He looked at her. She was standing now, gloves in hand, looking at him with her head at the considering angle. "Are you sad again?" "A little," he said. "It's a different kind, though." She thought about this. "Like when I'm sad about my dad, but also glad I had him?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "Exactly like that." She nodded, as if this confirmed something she'd already worked out. "Okay," she said, and walked past him toward the gate, the rabbit under one arm. He stood in the garden alone for another moment. Then he followed her inside. The days that followed had the particular quality of aftermath. Not peace exactly, because peace implies the absence of work, and there was a great deal of work. But the work was different in kind. It was the work of dismantling rather than defending. The work of opening things that had been closed. Holt called daily with updates on the regulatory process. Felix's accounts remained frozen. 3 of his political allies, reading the situation with the survival instinct of men who had not accumulated power by being loyal to losing positions, quietly withdrew their support and indicated availability for other conversations. The financial complaint Felix had filed was reviewed and dismissed within a week, partly because the counter-documentation was thorough, partly because the investigator assigned to the case found it extremely interesting that the filer's own records were currently under scrutiny by the same board. Vivian left the estate on the 3rd morning after the night at the port. She came to find Damien before she left, which he hadn't expected. She stood in the doorway of the study in her coat, her bag in her hand, looking like a woman who had made a series of decisions and was standing in the aftermath of them with her eyes open. "I'm going to stay out of this city for a while," she said. "There's a property I have in the south. I'll be there." "All right," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "I want to say something, and I want you to understand that I'm not saying it because I want anything from you. I'm saying it because it's true, and I think true things should be said when there's an opportunity." He waited. "I knew this arrangement wasn't what either of us needed," she said. "I knew it from the 2nd month. I stayed because my father wanted me to, and because I told myself that was reason enough." She held his gaze. "The woman downstairs and her daughter. They're not a complication, Damien. They're the least complicated thing in this house." She paused. "That's all." She left. He sat in the study for a while after she was gone and thought about what she'd said, and found it was accurate and found that accurate things still had weight, even when you'd already arrived at them yourself. Felix DeLuca's formal legal proceedings began 6 weeks after the night at the port. Damien didn't attend. He sent Holt and a second lawyer and 3 folders of documentation that Carver had assembled with the thoroughness of a man who understood that the legal version of justice required specificity, not narrative. The proceedings went on for months, as these things do, moving through their institutional process with the grinding patience of systems that are not built for speed but are built, when properly engaged, to close completely. Damien restructured. It was not a simple process, and it was not a clean one. 3 of the organization's existing operations were in territories that had operated for years under arrangements that couldn't be legitimized without unraveling them entirely, which meant accepting real financial loss in exchange for real legal standing. He accepted it. Carver, who had become, in the absence of Riordan, the person Damien relied on most, worked through it without complaint, managing the transition with the methodical attention of a man who had decided this was the right direction and was not going to say so out loud because some things don't require commentary. The harbor arrangement that Damien had used to secure the Weston Group's alliance commitment was the most complex piece. It took 2 months to restructure and cost more than Damien had initially projected. He restructured it anyway. He hired a legitimate property management company, to take over the 3 commercial properties that had been generating income through methods that didn't bear close examination. He hired actual accountants, the kind who worked in offices with windows and had their names on the door. He had several uncomfortable conversations with people who had done business with him for years and had grown accustomed to the particular flexibility of how that business had been conducted. Some of those people walked away. He let them. Carver watched all of this and said, one evening in the study, when they'd finished reviewing the week's numbers, "You understand this is going to take years." "Yes," Damien said, "and that the version of this organization that comes out the other end is going to be substantially smaller." "Also, yes." Carver looked at him. "You've already decided." "I decided the night I sat on that bench in the garden," Damien said. "I just needed to do the math first to make sure I was deciding based on what I actually wanted, and not based on sentiment." "And the math says?" "The math says it's possible. Slower and smaller and possible." He looked at the window. "That's enough." Carver nodded once, the nod of a man who has been given a direction he can work with, and went back to the numbers. Elena noticed the changes the way she noticed most things, quietly, without making an announcement of it, the observation accumulating over days until she had enough pieces to see the shape. She noticed that the men at the perimeter gradually reduced in number as the weeks passed. She noticed that Damien's phone calls changed in register, less clipped, less operational, more the tone of a man working through a process than a man managing a crisis. She noticed that he came to the garden more, not at night and not from a distance, but actually in it, in the mornings sometimes, sitting on the iron bench with his coffee while Lily tended the shoot, which had grown through October into something unmistakably, triumphantly itself. A sunflower, taller than the fence now, the head beginning to form. The whole thing so structurally improbable in the late autumn garden that it seemed to be making a point. She and Damien had been moving toward a conversation for weeks. They were both aware of it. They'd been circling it with the careful deliberateness of 2 people who have both lost enough to know that the territory between wanting something and saying so out loud is not nothing, is not a formality to be rushed. It happened on a Tuesday evening in November. Lily had gone to bed. Mrs. Aldrin had retired. The house was in its nighttime state, not the sealed mausoleum silence of the first weeks, but the inhabited quiet of a house that has people in it who are at rest. Damien found Elena in the kitchen, which had become the place where they ended up when neither of them was ready to say goodnight. Not by design, just by the gravity of habit, the way certain rooms collect people who have nowhere else they need to be. She was at the counter with a cup of tea, looking at nothing in particular, doing the thing she did sometimes where her face was completely at rest, and you could see what she looked like when she wasn't managing anything. He sat on the stool across the counter. She looked at him. "I want to say something," he said. She set her cup down. "All right. I've been thinking about how to say it for about 3 weeks." He looked at his hands on the counter. "I've written versions of it in my head, and they all sound like either too much or not enough, so I'm going to say the plain version and let it be imperfect." She was very still, watching him. "You came here for a job," he said. "You were professional and careful, and you followed the rules of this house, and you didn't ask for anything that wasn't offered. And then your daughter sat down in a dead garden and started watering things that hadn't been watered in 3 years. And something happened that I didn't plan for and couldn't have prevented. And..." He paused. "And I'm not the same person I was in October. I don't fully know who I am now, but I know that whatever I'm becoming, I want you in it, both of you." He looked up. "That's the plain version." Elena looked at him across the counter. Her face was doing several things at once, the way faces do when the thing being said has been known for a while, but hearing it still changes the texture of the air. "I knew," she said quietly. "I've known for weeks." She held his gaze. "I've been waiting to see if you'd say it or talk yourself out of it." "I almost talked myself out of it 3 times." "I know. I watched you do it." He looked at her. "And?" "And I was going to give you 1 more week." Her mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile, but lived near one. "Then I was going to say it myself, because I've been doing things myself for long enough that waiting stopped feeling like patience and started feeling like a bad habit." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I'm not the man I was before the bombing. I want to be honest about that. I don't know if that version of me comes back or if this version is what there is. I'm not the woman I was before Marcus died either," she said. I know things about loss and about being alone that I didn't know before, and some of them made me better, and some of them made me harder, and I haven't finished sorting out which is which. She held his gaze. I'm not asking you for the version of you before. I'm asking for this one. He was quiet for a moment. He was a good man. Marcus. She looked at him. How did you... You told me the night you came to my study. About Lily talking to his photograph. About promising to protect you. He paused. A 4-year-old who makes promises like that learned it from somewhere. The person she's learning to be? Her father made that possible. Elena pressed her lips together. She looked at the counter for a moment. When she looked back up, her eyes were clear, but the kind of clear that cost something. Yes, she said. He did. A pause. He would have said something practical and slightly annoying about this situation. What would he have said? She almost smiled. He would have said, you needed help, and help came. Stop making it complicated. Damien looked at her. Smart man. Infuriatingly so, she said. And this time she did smile. The real one, not the managed one, the one that changed her whole face. Yes. To what you said. Yes. He didn't move toward her. He didn't have to. They were already in the same place, had been for weeks, and the word was just the thing that made it official between two people who were done pretending they were somewhere else. The months that followed were not simple, because nothing after real loss is simple. There were days when Damien sat in his study and felt the grief of Sophia and his wife move through him with the unannounced force of weather. Not lessened, not replaced, but different in the way that grief changes shape when you build a life around it instead of inside it. There were nights when Elena woke at 3 in the morning with the specific disorientation of a woman who has slept alone for over a year and now hasn't, and lay in the dark doing the quiet internal work of integrating the reality of being loved again with the reality of everything that had happened before. Lily had no such adjustment period. She had decided, somewhere around the second week of November, that the situation was correct and required no further analysis on her part. She informed Damien of this one morning in the garden. They were both crouching beside the sunflower, which had made it through an early frost with the same inexplicable stubbornness with which it had made it through 3 years of neglect, and she did it by simply putting her hand in his and continuing to look at the flower, as if the gesture was administrative, a thing that needed to be done to complete a form. He looked down at her hand in his. Then he looked at the flower. Then he looked at the frost-touched garden around them, the raised beds that had been cleared and turned and replanted over the past weeks, the iron bench, the stone path, the shapes that his wife had drawn freehand because freehand felt more alive. Lily, he said. Yeah. I want to ask you something important. She looked at him. The rabbit was under her other arm. She was wearing the gardening gloves, and one of them had a small tear in the index finger that she'd refused to let Elena replace because, she said, it was already broken in right. I want to ask you, he said, if it would be all right with you, if I became your father. She looked at him for a moment with her whole face. I thought you already were, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Something moved through his chest that he didn't try to name or contain. I want to make it official, he said, the way important things should be official. She considered this with the seriousness she brought to decisions. Would it change anything? Not how things are, he said, just what they're called. She seemed to find this acceptable. Then yes, she said, and turned back to the flower, still holding his hand. He stayed crouched beside her for a while. He asked Elena that evening. Not with a ring, he'd thought about it and decided a ring was a step that should be earned through more time than they'd had, and that the question was what mattered right now, the question and the answer and what came after. He asked her in the kitchen, standing at the counter where they'd had the first real conversation, and she looked at him for a long moment after he'd said it, and he could see her doing the honest thing she always did, running it through the part of herself that had been burned before and checking whether the answer was fear or want, and coming out on the side of want. Yes, she said, but I want you to know something first. What? I don't need you to fix what Marcus left behind, she said. I know you've been paying bills and covering debts, and I accepted it because the situation was what it was. But going forward, I'm a partner, not a project. If this is going to be real, that has to be real too. He looked at her steadily. I know that. I need you to say it. You're a partner, he said. Not a project, not a complication, not something I'm managing. He held her gaze. You're the person I'm building something with. That's different from all of those things. She looked at him for another moment. Then, yes, she said again. All right. Yes. They were married in the spring. Not a large wedding. Neither of them wanted a large wedding, and the category of people they would invite was smaller than it once was, which was a grief of its own kind, but also a clarification. Carver was there. Holt came, which surprised Damien but shouldn't have. Holt had been his lawyer for 9 years and had, in those years, held more of Damien's private business in confidence than anyone except Reardon, and Holt was the kind of man who showed up when things were concluded. Mrs. Aldrin was there in the way that Mrs. Aldrin was present for everything, at the edge of the event, managing the details that kept the day from flying apart, dressed in something she'd clearly bought for the occasion and was clearly not going to mention. They married in the garden. The sunflower was there. It had been cut back in the winter and had come back in the spring with the same unreasonable commitment to its own survival, taller now, anchored, the head turned toward whatever light it could find. Around it, the beds that Elena and Lily and Damien had replanted over the fall and winter were filling in. Not the original planting, because some of those species were no longer available, and some of the beds had needed to be redesigned to account for 3 years of changed soil, but close. Close enough. Lily was the one who had insisted on the location. She'd presented her case at dinner 3 weeks before the wedding, with the specific clarity of someone who has identified the correct answer and cannot understand why it requires further discussion. The garden was where things had started. The garden was where things had grown. The garden was where you got married. What else would you do, honestly? Damien and Elena had looked at each other over the table. She's not wrong, Elena had said. She's usually not, Damien had said. Lily had eaten her dinner with the satisfaction of a point well made. On the morning of the wedding, Lily stood in the garden in a yellow dress she'd selected herself and had opinions about to a degree that had made the shopping trip memorable, holding the rabbit and a small bunch of wildflowers she'd picked from the edge of the east wall. And she stood very straight with the solemnity of someone who understood that this was a day that would be referred to later. Damien stood beside her. He was in a dark suit, no tie, which Elena had said was correct, and which Mrs. Aldrin had said was casual, and which had been resolved when Elena pointed out that it was their wedding. He stood in the garden his wife had made and looked at the beds and the stone path and the iron bench and the sunflower against the wall, and he held in his chest, simultaneously and without one canceling the other, the grief of everything that had been lost and the specific improbable weight of everything that was here. He thought of Sophia. He thought of her the way he was able to think of her now, not with the airless, crushing grief of the first year, not with the managed, careful containment of the 2 years after that, but with the open, present love of a man who has accepted that the person he lost is gone, and that being gone does not make them less. She would have been 7. She would have had opinions about the yellow dress. She would have wanted to walk down the path too, and she would have walked it with the same combination of ceremony and total unself-consciousness that Lily brought to everything. He thought she would have liked Lily. He thought Lily would have liked her. Lily tugged his hand. "She's coming," she said. He looked up. Elena came through the garden gate in something simple and light-colored, not white, the color of the inside of a flower, cream or pale gold depending on where the light hit it, and she walked down the stone path toward him with no music and no announcement, just the simple forward motion of a woman who has decided where she's going and is going there. She reached him. She looked at him. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said. Lily looked between them with the expression of someone watching a process. She'd understood would happen and is glad is finally happening. She held out the wildflowers, which Elena took, and then Lily stepped to one side and stood very straight and waited, holding the rabbit, as if she were an official witness, which she was. The man who officiated was a civil registrar who drove out from the city and was back on the highway within an hour. The words were the standard words, not customized, not literary, just the plain functional language of a legal and genuine commitment, which felt right for two people who had gotten to this place by being honest rather than eloquent. When it was done, Damien looked at Elena, and Elena looked at Damien, and the spring garden was around them with its improbable, stubborn growing things, and the sunflower at the back wall leaning toward the available light. And there was nothing to say that the moment didn't already contain. Lily said, "Can we eat now?" Mrs. Aldrin, from somewhere behind them, made a sound that in a less composed woman would have been called a laugh. Later, after the meal, Lily had fallen asleep in her chair and been carried inside, and after Mrs. Aldrin had handled everything with her customary invisible efficiency, Damien and Elena sat on the iron bench in the garden in the evening light. Elena had her shoes off. Damien had his jacket off. The garden was going gold and gray around them as the light changed, the beds casting long shadows, the sunflower at the back wall still catching the last of it. "Tell me something about her," Elena said. He looked at her. "Sophia," she said. Not carefully, not with excessive delicacy, just as a fact, as a name, as the thing she meant. "Tell me something I don't know about her." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the garden. "She named all the sunflowers," he said. "Not the plants, the individual flowers. Each head was a different name. She had a system for remembering which was which. I never fully understood the system." He paused. When she talked to them, she used the names. She was very specific about it. "What were the names?" He thought about it. "I can remember 3. The big one near the back wall was Gerald. There was one by the gate that she called Margaret, and there was a very small one at the end of the first bed that she called Pete." He paused. She said Pete was her favorite because he was trying harder than the others. Elena looked at the back wall, at the sunflower. "The one that came back," she said, "the one that came through the winter." "Yes." She looked at it for a moment. "I think Pete made it," she said. He looked at the sunflower. At its turned head, its frost-survived stem, the stubborn, improbable fact of its presence. "Yeah," he said, "I think you might be right." They sat on the bench in the evening until the light was gone and the garden went to shadow and the first stars became visible above the property's old trees. Neither of them moved to go inside. The house would be there when they were ready. The morning would come. Lily would wake up and put on her boots and her gloves and go back to her tending, because that was her nature, the same way it was Pete's nature to press upward through frost and neglect toward available light. The man who had once moved through his own house like a guest sat in the garden his wife had planted and breathed the spring air and felt the full complicated weight of being alive. Not the absence of grief, not the erasure of loss, but something alongside those things and past them. The specific difficult grace of a person who has decided to keep going, not because the pain is gone, but because the people beside him are worth keeping going for. Elena's hand found his on the bench between them. He held it. In the garden, Pete held his ground against the coming dark and did not move, the way things that have decided to survive tend to do, without drama, without announcement, just the steady continued presence of something that was asked once whether it would give up and answered, in the only language it had, no.